Welcome to the Midnight Library, a place where the night feels calm, the world slows down, and stories become a gentle pathway to rest. Find a quiet spot, settle in, and let your body sink into stillness. Breathe deeply in and out, leaving the day behind. This is your time to rest, your time to dream, your time to drift. And now, let us begin tonight's story.
Under the soft silver wash of moonlight, the world felt quieter than it should have. The air trembled with the faint sound of waves brushing the shore, and somewhere beyond the dunes, a single light flickered in the window of an old seaside inn. Inside that dimly lit parlor stood a grand piano, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust and its keys yellowed with the years. But when the clock struck midnight, something curious happened. The piano played a single note. Low, tender, and trembling, it echoed through the room like the sigh of an old soul remembering how to breathe. For decades, the townsfolk had whispered about the piano that sang under moonlight. Some said it was haunted, others that it was enchanted. The inn, called the Moonrise Haven, had once been a lively place where travelers gathered to rest and listen to music played by a woman with long auburn hair and eyes like twilight. Her name was Evelyn Wren, and her melodies could still the heart of a storm. She had lived there with her husband, Henry, who built the piano himself as a wedding gift. The two of them filled the inn with laughter and warmth until one night, a storm took him away at sea. From that night on, Evelyn played only for the moon, her music drifting across the dark waters as though she hoped it might reach him. And when she finally passed, the piano stayed behind, waiting. No one played it after her death. Guests would glance at it, maybe even run their fingers along its frame, but none dared touch the keys. There was something sacred about it, something that seemed alive in its silence. The inn changed hands many times over the years, but each new owner left the piano exactly where it stood, facing the tall window that looked out over the ocean. It was said that sometimes, when the moon rose full and clear, a soft melody could be heard, faint but unmistakable, the ghost of a song too beautiful to be forgotten. On a cold autumn evening many years later, a young woman named Clara arrived at the Moonrise Haven. She was a musician, though she hadn't played in months. Her hands trembled when she tried, not from lack of skill but from something heavier, grief that had silenced her heart. She had lost her father, the only person who truly understood her love for music, and since his passing, the piano she owned back home felt foreign beneath her touch. She'd come to the coast for peace, hoping the sea might quiet her restless thoughts. The innkeeper, a kind man named Walter, showed her to her room, a small corner suite with a view of the water. "It's an old place," he said with a chuckle as he set down her bags. "You might hear the floorboards talking in the night. And if you hear music, well, that's just the wind." His eyes twinkled when he said it, but Clara caught something else in his tone, something like reverence. Later that night, after the guests had gone to bed and the hallways were hushed, Clara wandered downstairs. She found herself standing at the entrance to the parlor, the faint gleam of moonlight spilling through the window, landing on the old piano like a silver shawl. She felt drawn to it, though she couldn't explain why. The air smelled faintly of salt and old wood polish. Her fingers brushed against the keys, and though they were cool to the touch, something beneath them seemed to hum softly like a pulse. She sat down before she could think better of it. For a long moment she just stared at the keys, her heart pounding. Then, almost without realizing it, she pressed one. The note rang out, pure and fragile, and she froze. It lingered in the air longer than it should have, its echo stretching like the reflection of moonlight over the tide. When she pressed another, it was answered by a faint, ghostly harmony, as if someone else had joined her, unseen. Clara's breath caught. The sound was beautiful, yet impossibly sad. It wasn't frightening. It was like being in the presence of memory itself. She began to play, slowly at first, then with growing confidence, each note blending into the next until the room was filled with music that shimmered like moonlit water. Upstairs, Walter sat in his armchair listening. He smiled faintly. He had heard that melody before, Evelyn's lament, the song the woman had played every night after her husband was lost. It had been decades since he'd last heard it, and yet the same haunting sweetness filled the inn once more. He whispered softly to the empty room, "She's found you again." When Clara finally stopped playing, the silence that followed felt alive. She stood, her hands trembling, and whispered to the empty room, "Who are you?" There was no answer. but the faint scent of lilacs drifted through the air, though no flowers grew nearby. A gentle warmth settled over her shoulders, like a comforting hand. She didn't know why, but tears welled in her eyes. That night she dreamed of the sea. She stood on the shore beneath a silver sky, and a woman in a flowing white gown stood beside her, her auburn hair glinting in the moonlight. The woman smiled and placed her hand over Clara's. "Music never dies," she said softly. "It only waits for someone to listen." When Clara awoke, her pillow was damp with tears, and her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The following days passed quietly. Clara began to rise early, spending her mornings walking along the cliffs, her evenings by the piano. The other guests sometimes gathered outside the parlor to listen, though none dared enter. There was something about the sound that made even the most troubled hearts still. One guest, a painter, said the melodies reminded him of the way moonlight touched water. Another said it made her remember someone she had long forgotten. Each night when Clara played, the world seemed to pause, and the olden seemed to breathe again. One evening, as the tide rolled in heavy and slow, Walter told her the full story of Evelyn Wren and her lost husband. He spoke of the storms, of the waiting, of the final night she played before she passed. "She said she'd leave her heart in that piano," he told Clara softly. "Said it might help someone find their way back to music one day." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe she was right," she whispered. But there was something more that Clara didn't tell him. That each night when she played, she could feel someone beside her. A faint brush of warmth near her shoulder, a harmony that rose from nowhere, a sense that the room was gently swaying as though the sea itself were keeping time. Once, when she paused mid-song, she thought she heard a whisper, "Keep playing." As the weeks passed, the line between dream and waking blurred. Clara began to dream of the sea every night. The woman was always there, sometimes sitting at the piano, sometimes walking along the waves. But one night the dream changed. The woman looked at her and said, "There's something waiting for you." Then she gestured toward the water. Clara followed her gaze and saw something gleaming beneath the surface. A small wooden box half buried in sand. When she woke, the dream stayed vivid in her mind. That morning, she walked down to the shore at low tide. The sky was pale gray, the sea calm as glass. She followed the line of the waves until she saw something small and wooden glinting beneath the wet sand. Her breath caught as she knelt and unearthed it. A small box, worn but intact. Inside, wrapped in faded velvet, was a folded letter. The paper was brittle with age, but the ink was still clear. It was signed E.W. and addressed to the one who plays for the moon. The letter spoke of love and loss, of how Evelyn believed her music would one day guide another lost soul back to the light. "When you play," the letter read, "you give voice to all that cannot speak. Promise me you will keep the music alive." Clara sat there for a long time, the waves brushing her feet, the letter trembling in her hands. She felt the warmth of tears on her cheeks, but they were not sad ones. She looked out over the water and whispered, "I promise." That night she played longer than ever before. The music flowed through her like the sea itself, carrying with it all the sorrow she had kept locked away. And when she reached the final note, she felt something lift inside her, like wings unfolding. The room was filled with a soft light, and for just a moment, she saw Evelyn standing near the window smiling, her eyes filled with peace. Then the figure faded into the glow of the moon. After that night, the piano never played on its own again. Clara stayed at the inn for the rest of the season, performing for anyone who wished to listen. Her music became the soul of the Moonrise haven once more, not as a ghost's lament, but as a living melody of hope. And every full moon, when the sea shimmered like glass, she would set a single candle on the piano and whisper, "For you, Evelyn." Years later, when Clara herself had grown old, a young traveler checked into the inn. He was a pianist too, searching for inspiration. On his first night, he wandered into the parlor and found the piano waiting by the window, moonlight resting gently upon it. He sat uncertain and pressed a single key. The note rang pure like a greeting, and though the inn was silent, he thought he heard a faint whisper in the air, soft as a sigh, "Play." And so the music began again, rising through the moonlight, carrying with it the breath of all who had ever loved, lost, and found their way back to the song. The sea listened, the stars swayed, and the old piano, beneath the glow of the moon, remembered every note. The night deepened around the old inn, wrapping it in velvet darkness and the endless whisper of the ocean. The moon hung like a lantern above the tide, painting the waves with slow-moving light. The inn itself seemed half asleep, its windows flickering softly, its timbers sighing as if they too could feel the rhythm of the sea. And yet, within the parlor, something was stirring again. Clara sat before the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys, her heart beating in time with the waves outside. She no longer felt fear or hesitation. The music had become a language she finally understood again, one that belonged to both the living and the gone. Her hands fell gently upon the keys, and the melody rose like breath, soft and steady. It began as a lullaby, something that might have soothed a child to sleep, but as she played on, it deepened, notes rolling like tides, each one dissolving into the next. The sound filled the air, lingered against the window panes, drifted out toward the sea. It was as though the music itself wanted to escape, to travel across the water to wherever souls go when they are done waiting. Clara's eyes fluttered shut. She imagined Evelyn there by the window, listening as she had so many nights before, her face bathed in moonlight, her sorrow finally eased. Outside, the waves began to shimmer as though responding to the song. Seabirds stilled upon their perches, the wind softened, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The music carried memories of love, of longing, of voices that once filled this room with laughter. She could almost hear them again, faint echoes of guests clinking glasses, of Henry's deep laugh as Evelyn played, of the creak of the piano stool as she leaned into the final notes of a song that always ended in a sigh. It was all there in the melody, returning like tidewater to shore. As Clara played, she began to feel something new, a warmth rising through her chest, spreading to her fingertips. The piano no longer felt cold beneath her hands. It pulsed gently as though it too were alive, listening, remembering. The music became an unbroken thread that connected her to something vast and unseen, something that existed beyond time or distance. It was no longer just Evelyn's music or Clara's. It was both, and it was more. It was the memory of love itself, retold through sound. She played until the night grew thin and the horizon began to pale. Her eyelids felt heavy, but the calm that filled her was profound and whole. When at last she pressed the final note, it seemed to linger forever, shimmering faintly before dissolving into silence. The candle beside her had burned low, its flame trembling, and she smiled through tired tears. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. The next morning, Walter found her asleep at the piano, her hands still resting lightly on the keys. The air around her smelled faintly of lilacs again, and sunlight spilled across the room, touching everything with gold. He didn't wake her right away. Instead, he stood quietly and listened, certain he could still hear the ghost of the music echoing softly, like the sea humming to itself. Over the days that followed, Clara became the heart of the inn. Guests came not just for the seaside view but for the music that filled the parlor each evening. Her songs carried something unexplainable, a sense of stillness that wrapped around the listener like a gentle tide. Some cried without knowing why. Others simply closed their eyes and let the calm wash through them. Even those who did not believe in ghosts could feel that the piano had a soul, and that it had chosen Clara to bring it back to life. One winter's night, after the last guest had gone to bed, Clara sat before the piano and spoke softly into the quiet. "I think I understand now," she whispered. "You weren't haunting this place. You were waiting for someone to listen." The words felt right, and in the silence that followed, a faint creak from the piano seemed to answer her, as if in agreement. She laughed softly to herself, a sound like wind stirring leaves. As months passed, the sea changed colors, and the seasons slipped gently by. The Moonrise Haven became a small sanctuary for travelers who carried their own invisible weights. The piano's voice became a salve for them, and Clara's music turned each evening into something like prayer. The locals began to call her the Lady of Moonrise, a quiet guardian of sound and sea. But Clara always said the title belonged to someone else, a woman whose spirit still watched from beyond the waves. And though the world outside grew louder and faster, inside that in time still moved at the pace of the tide, slow, rhythmic, eternal. The moon waxed and waned, the sea breathed in and out, and every night the piano sang. When the years had turned many times and Clara had grown older, she still sat at the piano, her hands more fragile but her touch just as gentle. Her music had softened even more, becoming a murmur rather than a melody, something like a memory carried by wind. Sometimes when she played, she would catch her reflection in the window, the sea behind her, the moon rising over the horizon, and for a moment she would see two figures there instead of one. Hers and Evelyn's side by side, smiling, the past and present bound together in harmony. The night she finally closed her eyes for the last time, there was no sadness in the inn. The sea was calm, the air still. Walter, now much older himself, found her seated at the piano, her expression peaceful, as though she had drifted into a dream. The final note she had played still shimmered faintly in the air, long after her fingers had stilled. He placed a candle beside her, just as she had always done, and whispered, "Safe travels, Clara." After her passing, the inn fell quiet for a while. No one dared play the piano, but on certain nights when the moon rose full and the tide was high, guests swore they heard faint music drifting through the halls, two melodies intertwined, rising and falling like the breath of the sea. Some said it was just the wind, others said it was Evelyn and Clara playing together at last. Many years later, a young traveler came to the Moonrise haven. He was restless, burdened by a life that had left him feeling lost. When he entered the parlor and saw the piano by the window, something in him stilled. The moonlight touched the keys in a way that felt like invitation. He hesitated, then sat, pressing one key. The note hung in the air, pure, clear and bright. And though the inn was empty, he thought he heard, very faintly, two women laughing, the sound like silver waves breaking on the shore. He began to play. The music rose softly, filling the quiet with warmth. Outside, the sea shimmered, and the moon's reflection rippled gently across the waves. The inn seemed to breathe again, as if waking from a long dream. And for those who passed by that night, the melody they heard drifting through the open window sounded like memory and moonlight, like love returning home. The old piano at Moonrise kept listening, its voice carrying across the years. And though hands would come and go, each player left a piece of themselves within its song. The sea kept its rhythm, the moon kept its vigil, and the music went on soft, eternal, and filled with the kind of peace that only the night can hold. The wind that brushed against the inn that night carried with it the scent of salt and something older, something like memory. The sea whispered to the cliffs below, its sighs rhythmic and endless, as though repeating a lullaby to the shore. Inside the parlor, the candlelight danced gently upon the piano's polished wood, its glow revealing fingerprints faintly etched by time and devotion. The keys gleamed faintly, one missing its ivory face, others worn smooth by decades of tender touch. The room had grown used to silence over the years, but now it seemed alive again, waiting, listening, remembering. When the young traveler played, the music rose and fell like waves breathing against the rocks. His touch was tentative at first, as though afraid of breaking something fragile, but the sound that filled the room was warm and full of longing. Each note shimmered through the air, blending with the soft creak of the old walls and the sighing wind at the window. Somewhere deep in the house, the boards beneath the piano gave a low, almost human groan, as if the building itself were responding. The traveler closed his eyes. He didn't know why he felt tears prick at them. It wasn't sorrow exactly, it was something softer, a recognition he couldn't name. As he played, images flickered through his mind, ones that weren't his own. A woman in a long dress seated at this very piano, the glow of the moon outlining her figure. Another woman years later, her hair streaked with gray, smiling softly as her fingers glided over the same keys. Their faces were strangers to him, yet familiar in the way that dreams can be familiar, as though he had met them in some other time, under some other sky. The melody deepened. It was no longer just a song, it was a conversation. The traveler felt as though invisible hands joined his, guiding his rhythm, shaping his tone. The harmonies folded together, weaving new colors into the sound. The notes spilled into the night, floated through the open window, and drifted toward the sea. The moonlight seemed to shimmer in response. Walter, the old innkeeper, stood quietly in the doorway, his eyes wide and filled with quiet wonder. He'd thought he had heard every story this inn had to tell, but tonight, it was as though the house had chosen to speak again. The sound reminded him of something familiar, the same haunting sweetness that once filled this room when Clara played, and before her, Evelyn. He didn't move, didn't even breathe loudly, afraid to break the moment. As the young man's hands moved, the piano began to hum faintly, a resonance deep within the wood, rich and alive. He played until his arms grew heavy, until time seemed to blur. When at last he stopped, the final note lingered in the air long enough for him to feel the silence afterward settle like a sigh. He stayed at the inn for several days. During that time, he returned to the piano each night, drawn not by curiosity but by something more intimate, a feeling that the instrument was calling him. The other guests listened from their rooms, lulled by the melodies that seeped through the walls and into their dreams. More than one awoke in the night certain that they had heard voices in the music, laughter, whispers, and once, someone softly humming a tune too old to name. The traveler began to write down what he played, though he couldn't always remember how the songs began or ended. It was as if they wrote themselves, passing through him like wind through reeds. He filled pages with sketches of notes and melodies, naming them things like the sea's breath and Evelyn's dawn. He didn't know who Evelyn was, nor why her name felt so right upon his tongue. One night, while sitting beside the piano after playing, he looked up and saw a faint shimmer near the window. For a heartbeat, he thought it was the moon's reflection, but then it moved, a figure translucent standing beside the instrument. She wasn't frightening. She was luminous, her face calm, her eyes kind. Behind her stood another, slightly older, her smile just as gentle. Both women watched him with a quiet grace, as though proud of something. The room glowed softly with their light. He felt no fear, only stillness. The younger of the two, Evelyn, lifted her hand toward the piano, and though her fingers never touched the keys, the instrument answered. A single perfect note rang out, pure and clear. Then both figures faded slowly into the moonlight, leaving behind only the faint scent of lilac and sea air. The traveler sat for a long time after that, his heart full and trembling. When he finally went to bed, his dreams were peaceful and filled with music. In them he walked along the shoreline as two women played by the water's edge, their laughter mingling with the song of the tide. He woke before dawn, the melody still echoing in his chest, and knew he would never forget this place. As years passed, he became a composer. His music found its way into concert halls and onto records, though he never fully understood where his inspiration came from. Every piece he wrote seemed touched by something deeper, an unseen presence, a breath of moonlight and sound. When asked about his influences, he always smiled softly and said, "I once stayed at a little inn by the sea. I heard the ocean sing there." And so the Moonrise haven lived on. The piano remained, its wood polished by years of use, its sound forever touched by all those who had loved through it. Sometimes, when a guest arrived lost or weary, Walter, or later his daughter, would suggest they sit and play a note or two. Most did not, but those who did would find that the music came easily, as though their hearts already knew the way. On certain nights, when the sky was clear and the sea lay quiet, people passing by the cliffs could hear music drifting faintly from the inn. It was soft, full of longing and peace, blending perfectly with the whisper of the waves. Some swore it was only the wind through the shutters. Others, especially those who believed, said it was the sound of love that had never ended, of souls that had found their way home. In the end, the old piano became a kind of keeper, a guardian of sound and memory. It outlived the generations who tended it, yet it never aged in spirit. The sea changed, the town grew, the inn was renovated, but the piano remained, facing the window, waiting for moonrise. And every time someone sat before it and dared to play, the room filled again with that same silver warmth, that same quiet grace. The world outside would continue to rush and turn, but within those walls, time moved like water, slow, patient, eternal. And though none could see them anymore, those who played swore that sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, there was laughter in the notes and the faint scent of lilacs drifting through the air, as if Evelyn and Clara were still there, listening, their hands resting upon the keys of moon. The days at Moonrise Haven stretched on like a gentle dream, the kind that lingered between waking and sleep. Each morning the traveler awoke to the sound of distant gulls, and the rhythmic hush of the sea brushing against the rocks. The inn smelled of salt and old wood and coffee brewing somewhere down the hall. Sunlight poured through lace curtains, tracing delicate patterns on the worn floorboards. It was a quiet life, one that seemed to belong to another century. He found himself slowing down, matching his breath to the rhythm of the tides, as though the world outside this place no longer mattered. Every evening, he found himself drawn to the piano. He didn't decide to go. His feet simply carried him there, as though pulled by invisible strings. The old instrument waited faithfully, its wood warm from the day's sun, its ivory keys cool to the touch. Sometimes he would start with a few hesitant notes, a soft hum that mirrored the hum of the waves. Other nights he would dive into something deeper, losing himself in long, wandering melodies that filled the parlor with golden sound. The other guests came to love those nights. They never asked him to play, but when he did, they would pause whatever they were doing, putting down books, turning off lamps, even halting their quiet conversations. The music became part of the inn itself, as natural as the wind or the sea. The walls seemed to sigh in contentment. Even the flickering candles steadied their flames as though listening. Walter often sat by the corner table, pretending to read, but his eyes always lingered on the pianist. The melodies stirred old memories he thought long buried. Memories of his mother humming softly as she cleaned the parlor, his grandmother's voice floating down the hall, the sound of laughter during summers long past. He could almost hear his grandfather's gentle baritone saying, "Listen to the rain, Walter. The house knows how to sing if you let it." And indeed, the house seemed to breathe along with the piano now, the beams and floorboards gently creaking in rhythm, alive with a kind of tender awareness. The traveler found it hard to sleep on nights he played. The melodies echoed inside him, looping softly like waves returning to shore. Sometimes he would wake before dawn and hear faint strains of music drifting from the parlor, though he knew he had locked the door behind him. The first time it happened, he thought it was a dream. The second time, he sat up in bed listening. The tune was one he didn't recognize, slow, wistful, almost ancient. The moon was still high, silvering the floor. When he crept to the hallway, the sound stopped. He told Walter about it over breakfast, half laughing, though a part of him was unsettled. The innkeeper only nodded thoughtfully. "That piano's been here longer than the inn itself," Walter said. "My great-grandfather built this place around it. Said he couldn't leave it behind after it called him home." The traveler frowned slightly. "Called him home?" Walter smiled faintly. "That's what he used to say. Said he heard it play one night by itself, same as you. Sat down, played back, and never left again. After that, the traveler began leaving the window open when he played, letting the sea's breath in. He liked to think the piano was listening not only to him but to the ocean beyond, their melodies weaving together, one human, one eternal. Some nights, when the air was still, the reflection of the moon shimmered across the polished surface of the piano like liquid silver, and he imagined the music rising through it into the stars. One evening, after a soft rain, he found a letter slipped beneath his door. The paper was thin, the handwriting old-fashioned and elegant. It read, "Thank you for waking the song. Play tonight at Moonrise and you'll understand." He turned it over, searching for a signature, but there was none. The ink smelled faintly of lavender. That night, the moon rose full and brilliant over the sea. The inn was quiet. The guests had gone to bed early. He lit 2 candles and sat before the piano, his heart beating fast. He began to play without thinking, his fingers following a melody he didn't recognize but somehow knew. The room filled with sound, layered and luminous. The wind at the window seemed to harmonize. The candles flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. And then, just as before, the shimmer appeared near the window. But this time it didn't fade. It grew stronger, solidifying into 2 women standing side by side. Their dresses glowed faintly as though woven from starlight. They smiled at him not as strangers but as old friends. Evelyn, the name echoed in his mind like a memory returning, and beside her, Clara, serene and radiant. The older woman reached out, touching the air above the keys, and though her hand passed through, the note that followed was the most beautiful he had ever heard. It was as if the piano itself was weeping in joy. The traveler's vision blurred with tears. The air around him shimmered with warmth and moonlight, and for a moment he understood everything: the music, the sea, the soft pull that had brought him here. The piano was not just wood and string. It was memory, love, and longing woven into sound. It had carried the echoes of every soul who ever poured their heart into it, and now it was passing them to him. When the final note faded, the 2 figures smiled once more and vanished into the light, leaving behind a calm so deep it seemed to reach the ocean floor. The traveler sat in silence for a long time, his hand resting on the keys, the faint scent of lilac still lingering in the air. The next morning, Walter found him asleep by the piano, The candles melted to pools of wax. He didn't wake him. Instead, he placed a blanket over his shoulders and looked out the window toward the sea. For a moment he thought he heard a faint melody drifting across the waves, soft, distant, like a lullaby sung by the tide. The traveler stayed one more week, and then he left quietly, leaving behind a small notebook filled with handwritten music. On the cover, in neat letters, he had written Moonrise pieces. Walter kept it in a drawer beneath the counter, and every now and then on quiet evenings, he would open it and hum a few bars. The piano seemed to listen, humming faintly in response. Years turned into decades. The unchanged hands, new owners came and went, but the piano remained. Its keys yellowed, its strings loosened, yet the music within never faded. Guests who stayed there spoke of strange dreams filled with silver light, or waking in the night to hear soft music coming from nowhere. Some said it was the sea. Others whispered that it was the ghosts of the women who had once played there, still tending to their melodies under the watchful eye of the moon. One evening, long after Walter had passed, a young woman checked into the inn. She was a musician, traveling along the coast in search of inspiration. She found the piano in the corner of the parlor, covered in a thin layer of dust but still beautiful. When she pressed a key, it rang out clear and pure, startlingly alive. She smiled, sat down, and began to play. Outside, the waves shimmered under the moonlight, and for a brief, shining moment, the sea seemed to lean closer to listen. The old piano's voice rose again, tender and eternal, weaving its way into the night, carrying with it every song, every soul, and every whisper of love that had ever passed through its strings. And somewhere beyond the edge of hearing, in the quiet between one wave and the next, two faint voices laughed softly, their sound blending with the hush of the sea, as though the moon itself was smiling down upon them all. The next morning dawned slow and tender, like a deep breath after a long dream. The traveler stirred awake to the soft creaking of the inn as it stretched into the day. Outside his window, the horizon was painted in pink and gold, the ocean a vast sheet of glass catching the early light. He lingered in bed, watching the sun climb higher, feeling the gentle rhythm of the waves settle into his bones. There was peace here, an old living peace that felt earned, as though it had waited centuries just to be felt again. When he finally rose, he walked barefoot across the cool wooden floor, the scent of the sea drifting through the open window. The inn seemed quieter that morning, almost reverent. Even the gulls were softer in their calls. He descended the stairs and found Walter already in the kitchen, humming a tune that the traveler instantly recognized. It was one of the melodies he had played the night before. Walter looked up, his eyes kind and knowing. "You played beautifully," he said simply, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "The inn hasn't sounded that alive in a long time." The traveler hesitated before replying, the memory of the shimmering figure still vivid behind his eyes. "Did you hear anything else? Voices, maybe?" Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out toward the sea, his expression far away. "This house remembers," he said finally. "It holds on to what matters. Maybe it's the salt in the air or the wood, or the years of laughter and sorrow soaked into these walls. Or maybe some things never really leave, especially when they loved deeply enough to stay." The traveler nodded slowly. He didn't press further. Somehow, that explanation, gentle, unscientific, but deeply human, was enough. He spent the next few days exploring the coast. The village nearby was small, its cobblestone streets lined with flower boxes and quiet shops that smelled of parchment, tea, and rain. He found a bookstore tucked between 2 cottages, the kind of place that looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. The woman behind the counter greeted him as if she had known him for years. She spoke of the tides, of stories whispered by the wind, and when he mentioned the old inn, her face softened. "Ah," she said, "the Moonrise Haven. That place is special. My grandmother used to say that music could open doors there, doors between what is and what was. She claimed she heard a waltz one night that no one else could hear." He smiled faintly. Maybe she did. When he returned to the inn that evening, the piano seemed to be waiting. The light from the setting sun poured through the windows, catching the dust motes in a golden dance. He sat once more and rested his fingers on the keys. For a long moment he didn't play. He just listened to the wind, the creak of the timbers, the sigh of the waves. Then slowly he began to play. Not the song from before, but something new, something born from what he'd seen and heard and felt. The melody began softly, a whisper, then grew fuller, rising like the tide. The inn responded as if it were breathing along with him. The sound swelled and filled the air until it seemed to pour through the open windows, out into the night. The moon was climbing then, silvering the sea, and as he played, he could swear he heard faint laughter, like the echo of joy that had once lived here long ago. The candles flickered, their flames bending toward the sound, and the shadows on the walls danced in rhythm. The music wrapped itself around him, filling every corner of the room until time itself seemed to hold still. The traveler's heart beat slow and steady, one with the rhythm of the notes. Hours passed, though he didn't notice. When at last the final chord faded, the air seemed to shimmer with warmth. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, like the pause between waves. He rested his hands in his lap, breathing deeply, the world outside the window silver and still. That night he dreamed of the sea. He saw the inn standing on the edge of eternity, its windows glowing like lanterns in the mist. Inside, two women sat at the piano, their hands moving in perfect harmony. The melody they played was the same one he'd written that evening. And when they turned to look at him, he saw peace in their faces, a serenity that felt eternal. Evelyn and Clara nodded, and their image dissolved into the moonlight until only the music remained. When he awoke, the first rays of dawn were breaking across the water. The piano stood quiet, yet the room still carried the faint scent of lilacs and salt. He smiled softly, knowing the song was complete, not just his but theirs. Before leaving the inn, he placed a letter on the piano's music stand. It read, "To whoever finds this, play when the moon is high and listen closely. You'll hear the sea sing back." Years later, that same letter would be found by the young musician who wandered in from the coast. She would smile as she read it, sit down, and let her fingers find the keys. The first note she played would echo across the still water, and the sea would shimmer in reply, as though remembering an old, beloved tune. From that night onward, whenever someone played the piano at Moonrise Haven, the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The sound drifted beyond the shore, into the deep quiet of the world, and somewhere in that vastness the moon listened. And if you stood on the cliffs above the inn, with your eyes closed and your heart open, you might still hear it, the low, haunting song of the old piano, mingling with the sigh of the waves and the whisper of time, carrying the memory of love that refused to fade. The traveler was gone, the guests long since departed, but the house still listened. It remembered every note, every quiet night, every story written in the language of the sea. And when the rain came, soft and slow against the windows, it would hum in reply, as though the music lived on in its walls, waiting for the next soul to listen. And so the piano played on, sometimes in the hands of strangers, sometimes by no one at all, but always for the same reason, to remind the world that beauty, once awakened, never truly fades. It simply changes form, becoming sound, memory, and silence, bound forever to the sea that once heard it first. The storm arrived quietly that night, rolling in from the edge of the sea like a memory returning after years of silence. The traveler, now a little older and changed in ways even he couldn't explain, stood by the window of his room in the inn and watched as the first flashes of lightning trembled across the horizon. The air smelled of rain and salt, of wet stone and distance. Somewhere far below, the sea murmured, its voice rising and falling like a song half remembered. He didn't mind the storm. He never had. There was something sacred about it, something that reminded him of how small and alive everything was. He drew the curtain back and let the sound fill the room, the low rumble of thunder, the hush of wind sliding past the glass, and beneath it all the faintest hum, a sound he had come to know as the heartbeat of the house itself. The piano was downstairs, silent for the moment, but he could feel its presence the way one feels another heartbeat in the dark. The candlelight flickered beside him. He picked up his notebook, the same one he had carried since his first visit years ago. Its pages were filled with songs, fragments, and half-dreamed melodies that had come to him in moments like this. He turned to a blank page, listening to the rhythm of the rain. Then he wrote the title at the top, Moonrise Sonata. When the thunder faded, he went downstairs. The parlor was dim, the air thick with the scent of wood polish and sea air. The piano waited in its usual place, glowing faintly in the candlelight. He touched the keys and they felt warm, as though someone had just been playing them. He began with a single note, soft, careful, like the beginning of a conversation with an old friend. Then another. The melody grew, gentle but certain, flowing between his hands. Outside, the rain struck the windows in rhythm, as if the world itself was keeping time with him. The sea roared in the distance, blending into the music. As he played, memories came, not just his own but others that seemed to belong to the piano. A child laughing in the morning sun. A woman sitting beside the window with her hair pinned up, humming to herself. A sailor returning home, placing his hands on the same keys after months at sea. Every note he played felt like a thread pulled from time itself, weaving lives together into sound. At one point he paused, letting the last chord fade. For a moment there was nothing but the rain. Then, softly, another sound answered him, a faint echo like a whisper from another room. He lifted his hands, startled, but the piano continued to hum faintly, the vibration low and alive beneath his palms. And then he saw her again. Evelyn. She was standing in the doorway, just as before, her presence soft and shining, her eyes filled with the calm of the sea. Beside her stood Clara, their forms transparent but warm with light. They didn't speak, but he felt what they wanted to say. "You've kept the music alive." He smiled, a small and wordless smile, and began to play again. This time they moved closer, standing beside him, their hands ghosting over his own, shaping the music together. It was no longer just a melody, it was an entire memory being reborn. The room shimmered with light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Outside, the storm reached its height. The thunder rolled across the cliffs like applause, and the lightning flashed upon the sea, silvering the waves. And still the music went on, delicate, endless, whole. When the last note came, it didn't fade quickly. It lingered, vibrating in the air, humming through the floorboards, until the sound became part of the storm itself. Then everything fell still. The rain slowed, the thunder softened, and the room returned to its quiet breathing. The traveler looked up, and the figures were gone. But the air was full of warmth, and the faint scent of lilacs lingered once again. He sat there for a long time, watching the candle burn lower. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from awe. The piano glowed faintly, and when he pressed one of the keys again, it made no sound. But somehow, he knew the song hadn't ended. It had simply gone on ahead of him, into the sea, into the world. In the years that followed, the Moonrise Haven became more than just a place to rest. People spoke of it in hushed tones, as if afraid that too much attention might disturb its quiet magic. Travelers came from far away, writers, painters, musicians, drawn by rumors of a piano that could heal the heart. Some claimed they'd heard voices singing faintly in the night. Others swore that when they played, the room seemed to breathe with them. One night, a young woman arrived carrying a violin in a weathered case. She had the look of someone searching for something she couldn't name. The innkeeper, now Walter's granddaughter, showed her to the parlor and smiled. "Play," she said. "The house will listen." The woman did. Her music was shy at first, a hesitant conversation between wood and string. Then the piano responded, soft and slow, though no one sat before it. The sound grew warmer, fuller, like an unseen duet. The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she kept playing, her bow steady. And when the final note came, the inn felt lighter somehow, as if it had exhaled after holding its breath for years. She left the next morning, leaving behind a single pressed flower, a lilac, on the piano. The innkeeper found it there and placed it in a small glass bottle beside the window. It never withered. Decades later, the traveler's music was still being played in concert halls. Moonrise Sonata became his most beloved piece, though few knew its origin. When asked what inspired it, he always smiled and said, "It was given to me by the sea." Sometimes, when storms rolled across the coast, those who stayed near the cliffs would hear faint music on the wind, notes rising and falling with the rhythm of the tide. Some said it was the piano at the Moonrise Haven still playing. Others believed it was the souls of those who had loved, laughing softly in the rain. And on those nights, if one stood very still, they might hear a whisper, gentle, warm, and eternal. The song never ends. He stayed on for a few more weeks at the inn, each day folding itself gently into the next like the turning of well-worn pages. The ocean became his clock, the rise and fall of tides marking his hours more faithfully than any watch. He began each morning with quiet walks along the mist-draped shore, where the waves licked at his boots and gulls wheeled lazily above, calling out in that half-sad, half-playful way that only gulls can. The air there carried a strange sweetness, one born of salt and memory, as though the sea itself remembered everything it had ever touched. By afternoon, he would sit in the garden behind the inn, a little patch of earth protected from the wind by a low stone wall. There the flowers grew wild and unbothered, spilling over with lavender, bluebells, and pale white roses. Walter's granddaughter, Marin, tended to them with a care that felt almost reverent. She spoke little, but her hands always seemed to know what the plants needed. When she saw him watching one afternoon, she smiled shyly. "They like music," she said softly. "When you play, they turn toward the window." He laughed lightly, though the truth in her words sent a quiet shiver through him. That evening he played again, something simple, just a thread of melody. And indeed, when he looked out the window, the flowers seemed to tilt in his direction, swaying gently in rhythm with the song. As the days passed, his playing became part of the inn's breath. Guests came and went, each leaving behind a piece of their story. An old sailor who stared at the sea without speaking, a poet who scribbled lines between sips of tea, a widow who found herself crying, then laughing, then sleeping through the night for the first time in years. The piano's music reached all of them. It wasn't magic in the way stories described, but it was something deeper, a kind of remembering, a slow and patient healing. On one of those soft evenings, when the moon was a pale coin above the water, the traveler sat again at the piano. The room was empty except for the flicker of firelight and the scent of lilacs drifting in from the open window. His fingers hovered over the keys, and for the first time in days, he hesitated. There was something tugging at his thoughts. A sound beyond the walls, low and rhythmic. He paused to listen. It was the sea, yes, but there was something else beneath it. A pulse. A deep and living heartbeat that seemed to come from the earth itself. He pressed a single note on the piano, soft and steady, and the heartbeat answered in kind, a vibration that hummed through the floorboards, through his bones. Slowly he began to play, matching his rhythm to that pulse. The result was unlike anything he had played before. Ancient, full of movement like the shifting of tides. The music wrapped around him. The wind outside stilled. Even the crackle of the fire seemed to fade. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't in the room anymore. Not exactly. He was standing by the ocean, though not the one he knew. This sea was vast and silver under a moon that hung impossibly close, its light painting everything in soft brilliance. Beside him stood Evelyn and Clara, their faces serene, their eyes full of something beyond time. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice quiet, melodic. "You've listened well," she said. "Few hear the heart of this place anymore." He swallowed hard, unsure if he could even speak. "Why me?" he managed finally. Clara smiled faintly. "Because you loved without asking for anything back. You gave your heart to the music. That's all this house ever needed." Behind them the piano shimmered, not a physical one, but its shape woven from light and air. Its song continued, though no one touched it. The melody was endless and circular. The sound of moonlight turned into breath. "You must keep it alive," Evelyn said softly. "When people forget to listen, the sea grows lonely. Promise us you'll remind them." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes, though he couldn't tell if they were his or borrowed from the dream. The world around him began to fade, the silver sea dissolving into shadow. He heard one last note, clear, eternal, and then he was back in the parlor, his hands still resting on the keys. The fire had burned low. The candles had gone out. And yet the air was full of music. Not the sound itself, but its presence. A deep warmth, the kind that settles in your chest long after the melody fades. He rose, crossed to the window, and looked out over the darkened sea. The moonlight shimmered across the water in pale ribbons, and for a fleeting moment, he saw what looked like lanterns floating far out on the waves. But he knew better, they weren't lanterns. They were echoes, songs caught in the tide, traveling endlessly from shore to shore. He left the window open that night so the music could pass freely into the world. When morning came, the inn seemed brighter, lighter, as though the night had swept away everything heavy. Even the guests spoke softer, smiled easier. Marin placed fresh lilacs in the vase by the piano, and their fragrance lingered all day. The traveler wrote one last melody before he left. A soft waltz he titled The House That Listens. He placed the pages in a small envelope and tucked it inside the piano bench, where he hoped someone would one day find it. Then quietly he said goodbye. Walter was gone now, the sea older, but the inn still stood exactly as it always had, patient, waiting. He paused by the doorway, looking once more at the piano, at the sunlight pooling across its keys, and smiled. "Thank you," he whispered, "for letting me listen." Years later, when storms passed over the cliffs and thunder rolled like distant drums, locals would say they could hear faint notes riding on the wind. Sometimes they swore it sounded like a piano, other times like voices humming in harmony with the rain. And if you stood by the sea long enough, if you were quiet and open-hearted, you might just hear it too, a song without beginning or end, carried forever on the breath of the tide. And somewhere, far out where the moon touched the horizon, perhaps two figures stood hand in hand, smiling as they listened, the echo of their music mingling with the waves. The traveler's promise had been kept. The sea was never lonely again. The sea lingered outside the window like a lullaby that refused to end. The traveler sat once more at the small table by the glass, the faint glow of dawn spreading slowly across the horizon. The piano rested silent now, but its silence wasn't empty. It was alive with everything that had been played, every note that had once trembled through its wooden body. He could almost feel the warmth of it even now, like the fading touch of a hand that had only just left his own. The air was still cool, carrying the faint scent of salt and the soft musk of the wild roses that grew along the cliff. A gentle mist drifted through the open window, curling lazily around the piano bench before fading into the corners of the room. The traveler found himself smiling. The world was waking slowly, softly, the way a song fades in before you realize you've started humming it. He breathed deeply, letting the morning fill his chest. There was peace here, not the sharp kind that came from escape, but the deep, settled peace that grows only when you've truly arrived somewhere you didn't know you needed to be. He spent that morning wandering through the garden, tracing the stone paths that wound between the herbs and flowers. The bees were already awake, humming in slow circles around the lavender stalks. The sound of their wings joined the hush of the sea in a rhythm that felt as steady as a heartbeat. He knelt down to run his fingers through the damp soil and felt how cool and alive it was. Marin's footprints dotted the path ahead, small and light. She was already by the gate, trimming ivy from the fence, her hair catching the morning light like golden thread. "You're leaving soon," she said quietly without turning. He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Tomorrow. The road calls, I suppose." "It always does," she murmured. "But roads don't sing like the ocean does." He smiled at that. "No, they don't." She turned then, her face serious but kind. "Will you come back?" He hesitated. The sea wind brushed against his cheek like an answer. "Maybe not me," he said softly, "but the music will. That's the part that stays." Marin nodded, as if she already understood. "Then I'll keep listening." That night the inn felt different. There were more guests than usual, drawn in by rumor or instinct or perhaps by the quiet call of the piano itself. A family from the city arrived just before dusk, tired from travel but smiling when they heard the faint music echoing through the hall. An old painter took a corner seat near the hearth, sketching absently in a worn leather book. A young couple sat near the window, holding hands, their heads resting close together as they whispered. The traveler saw them and smiled, remembering another pair who had once done the same. When he sat down at the piano, a hush fell over the room. The fire flickered, the wind pressed softly against the windows, and even the creak of the wooden floorboards seemed to pause in reverence. He began to play, slowly at first, the same melody that had come to him the night before, the one that belonged to the sea. Each note rose and fell like a breath, like the tide brushing the shore. The guests listened, their eyes growing heavy with calm. Outside, the moon rose, casting a silvery shimmer across the water. The waves caught the light and scattered it like glass. The song deepened, weaving through the night like a lullaby for the world itself. It spoke of long roads and quiet rooms, of voices that lingered even after they were gone, of love that didn't end but transformed into something gentler, something eternal. As the music filled the room, the traveler thought of Evelyn and Clara again. He saw them in the flicker of candlelight, in the shimmer of reflection across the piano's surface. They were not ghosts, not exactly, more like memories turned into air and sound. He could feel their presence, the warmth of it, the way it folded around him like an embrace. The piano responded to it too. It sang more sweetly, more freely, as though the house itself were exhaling after a long, patient wait. He played until his hands trembled, until the last chord lingered and faded into silence. No one clapped. No one spoke. The guests simply sat there, breathing, their hearts slowed, their eyes wet or distant or shining with quiet awe. It was enough. The music had reached them. Later, when the inn had grown still again and the guests had drifted off to their rooms, the traveler remained by the piano, running his fingers gently along the keys. He thought about the countless hands that had touched them before, Walter's, Evelyn's, perhaps even strangers whose names were lost to time. The keys were worn smooth in places, faintly yellowed with age, but they held a kind of beauty that only time could give. He closed the lid softly, as though tucking a child into sleep. The sea murmured beyond the window, a low, endless hum. He poured himself a cup of tea and took it to the porch, watching the moonlight tremble across the waves. Somewhere out there, far beyond the dark line of the horizon, he imagined his past self walking along another shore, lost and searching. He wanted to tell that man that it would be all right, that one day the music would find him again, and with it the understanding that every loss was also an echo waiting to return. The wind shifted, cool and fragrant with salt. In it he thought he heard a voice, not loud, not even distinct, but there. A whisper perhaps, or the sigh of someone long gone. He smiled. The sea never forgot. When morning came he packed lightly, just a satchel, his notebook, and a small keepsake Marin had left for him. A pressed lilac wrapped in soft paper. Beneath it, she had written a single line, "For the man who made the flowers listen." He folded it carefully and slipped it inside his coat. Before he left, he touched the piano one last time. His fingers hovered, then pressed a single note. It rang clear and true, filling the quiet morning air. Outside, the ocean answered with a soft crash against the rocks, as though in farewell. He smiled and stepped through the door, the sound following him down the path, fading only when the sea swallowed the horizon. The inn remained behind him, sturdy and timeless, the kind of place that exists between worlds, part wood and stone, part memory and dream. Travelers still came and went, each carrying away something invisible yet precious. The calm that came from listening to a song that felt older than time. Sometimes, late at night, they would wake to the faint sound of a piano drifting through the halls, though no one was ever there. The locals simply said, "That's the sea playing through the wood again." And in a way it was true. Years turned gently like pages in a book. The world changed around the inn, the roads paved smoother, the towns busier. But the cliffs remained untouched, the ocean still vast and endless. And when storms rolled through, bringing thunder and rain that lashed the windows, the old piano would hum softly in its corner, answering in kind, the sound mingling with the rhythm of the world. They said that on especially quiet nights, if you stood by the garden and listened closely, you could hear two melodies woven together, one from the earth, one from the sky, and between them a man's voice murmuring like wind through glass, a voice that said, "Listen." The traveler's promise had outlived him. The house, the piano, the sea, they all remembered. The night grew deeper around the old inn, the kind of darkness that was not empty but full of the soft sounds of the living world settling into its dreams. The ocean moved with slow patience beyond the cliffs, and the stars hung like silver notes across the black sky. The traveler's footprints were already fading from the damp earth, and yet his presence lingered, gentle as the echo of a song. Inside, the piano sat by the window, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, glowing faintly like the last heartbeat of a long and peaceful evening. The air was cool, carrying with it the scent of rain that might come by morning. The entire house seemed to breathe, not loudly, not insistently, but softly, as though it too was resting. In the upstairs rooms, the guests slept soundly. Some dreamed of distant shores, others of voices long gone, others of nothing at all, just a soft, endless hum that carried them deeper into rest. The music that had filled the room earlier still lingered in the walls, woven into the grain of the wood and the whisper of the curtains as they moved in the breeze. Marin sat by the window for a long while, watching the sea. She had placed a single candle on the windowsill, its flame steady despite the draft. The light flickered gently over her face, her eyes reflecting the quiet movement of the waves. She could still hear the traveler's last note in her mind, that single sound that had seemed to open the air itself. It was a sound she knew she would carry with her for years. Below, the piano gave a faint sigh as the night wind brushed its keys. It was almost like a whisper, a fragment of melody that rose and fell before fading back into stillness. Maren smiled at the sound, her heart both heavy and light. "Good night," she whispered into the dark, and somehow it felt like someone answered. The moon drifted higher, casting silver across the lake, and the inn seemed to float on it, a quiet ship anchored in dreams. The garden glimmered faintly, the flowers nodding under the weight of dew. The path that led down to the water gleamed pale in the moonlight, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Far out beyond the rocks, a single lantern bobbed on the waves, perhaps a fisherman's, perhaps a trick of the tide. But if you stood at the window and listened closely, you might think it was something else. You might think it was a song made visible, a promise still alive in the dark. The night held its breath for a long, quiet moment. Then the breeze sighed again, the sea turned over gently, and all was still. And somewhere in the hush, beneath the rhythm of water and air, the faintest echo of a piano note drifted through, slow, warm, infinite. A reminder that even silence can sing if you learn how to listen. The house slept, the sea breathed, and the music of the world continued on, steady, endless, and at peace. Sleep now. The night is watching over you, calm and kind. The waves will keep their rhythm until morning, and when the sun rises again, it will be as though the song never ended at all, only changed its shape into light. The hours between midnight and dawn were the softest ones, when even the stars seemed to lower their voices. The sea beyond the inn had fallen into a slow, deep rhythm, the waves folding upon themselves like a lullaby too old to remember its words. The world was utterly still. Not empty but serene, full of quiet meaning. The inn's windows glowed faintly with moonlight. Curtains swayed like gentle breaths, and the faint scent of lavender drifted through the halls. The piano sat unmoving, its wooden body reflecting the silver light like water. Yet, for those who truly listened, there was something beneath the silence, not quite sound but memory. The echo of notes that lingered warm and alive, like the last embrace of a dream. Upstairs, the rooms were hushed. The last candle had melted into a pool of wax, its flame bowing gracefully into sleep. Maren had drifted into dreams by the window, her head resting against the glass. She dreamed of the traveler, of the way he played with his eyes closed, as if speaking to something beyond the room, as if the ocean itself were answering. In her dream, he was walking along the shore, his figure a soft blur against the silver sand, and from his hands glowed faint threads of light that drifted into the waves. She smiled even in her sleep, for she understood. The music had never truly belonged to him. It belonged to the world, to every quiet heart that needed it. The piano was just a vessel, the sea just a voice, the house just a keeper of sound. Outside, the wind stirred the grass, moving with a patient rhythm, brushing against the door frames and the roof like a familiar touch. The world seemed to hum. The flowers in the garden leaned toward the moonlight, their petals trembling softly as if swaying to a melody only they could hear. Somewhere far away, thunder murmured, not as a threat, but as a deep, sleepy sigh. Inside, the inn exhaled, a long, slow breath that filled the rooms with peace. Time for a while ceased to move forward. The past and the present blended into something gentle and endless. The house remembered every note ever played, every tear ever shed, every moment of stillness between heartbeats, and it promised to hold them all. By the piano, the sheet of music the traveler had left fluttered slightly. The ink shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and though no hands touched it, a single note seemed to rise, faint and tender, the softest whisper of harmony. It wound through the air like a drifting feather, slipped out through the open window, and vanished into the vastness of the night. The sound traveled far, across sleeping fields, over dark forests, and into the ocean's open arms. It joined the hum of the earth, the slow rhythm of waves, the deep breath of mountains. Somewhere out there, perhaps miles away, perhaps in another time entirely, someone might have heard it. A faint, comforting tone at the edge of consciousness, urging them to rest, to let go, to dream. And so the house by the sea continued to listen, to rain, to wind, to waves, to the pulse of the world. It waited, patiently, lovingly, for the next traveler to arrive. For someone new to sit by the window and wonder why the air felt like a song. For someone to add their own story to the unending melody that wrapped around the cliffs and drifted into the stars. The moon began to dip toward the horizon, its light softening to silver gray. Dawn was coming, slow and golden, stretching its first fingers across the sleeping sea. The house, the piano, the flowers, and the waves seemed to sigh in unison, as if content to welcome the light. When the first bird sang, it did so softly, as though afraid to disturb the dream. The sea answered with a whisper, and the world woke gently, tenderly, to another day. And in that quiet moment between night and morning, the last note of the traveler's song lingered still, a promise that peace could always be found, that every ending was just another beginning, and that somewhere music was always waiting for those who dared to listen. Now rest. Let the sound of the sea cradle you. Let the night carry you deeper into calm. You are safe. The world hums quietly around you, holding you, the way the ocean holds the shore. Drift now and sleep. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. And so, dear dreamer, our story finds its gentle close, but your night continues calm and unbroken. Let your thoughts drift, as lightly as clouds across a moonlit sky. Let your body sink, as deeply as roots into the quiet earth. There is no need to hold on, no need to listen further, only to rest, for the story remains with you, carrying you through the night, until morning's light comes softly to call. Good night, and sweet dreams. From the Midnight Library. Crescent moon sparkles, break time equals 2000/.